All right. I'm so excited for our interview today. It's been a long time since we've done one of these, and my hope is to do more of these as we go along. Life, as you all know, has been a little bit strange these last 2 years with the pandemic and various other life things that happen for folks. And so it's been no exception with me as well. So I'm so glad that we finally have a chance to land and get back into this idea of interviewing folks and talking about trauma and horses and horse-human relationships in various contexts. So as you all know, I'm Sarah Schlote. I'm a registered psychotherapist in Canada, and I am trained in a number of different trauma modalities or approaches for trauma recovery for humans, and have also been very interested in trauma recovery in horses and have a varied background with horses as well. And bringing the two together has been such a joy for me in terms of bringing this lens to looking at horse-human relationships and how do we navigate the nuances and complexity involved in horse-human relationships when there can be trauma happening in both beings. And so we'll be coming at these discussions from the standpoint of the different trainings that I have under my belt, and I'll name those where appropriate. And we'll be coming at this from the standpoint of the interviewees as well. And so without further ado, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Ines Kaiser to our interview series. And Ines, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into our topics for today.
With pleasure, and thank you so much, Sarah, for this introduction. I am really excited to be here today and to talk with you about these topics that we have already briefly brainstormed, and to share these with a wider audience. I am myself trained in body-oriented psychotherapy and other therapeutic modalities. And in the recent years, I've been more involved with the topic of trauma. And I'm an SEP, like somatic experiencing practitioner. And I am also on board with you on the EQUUSOMA training, faculty in training. And I have about 35 years of experience with horses in many different areas. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. I have been away from horse training for a number of years. And in between, I really had the opportunity to deep dive in some of the more therapeutic and trauma-oriented approaches. And I was recently experimenting with some of these spaces and coming back to horse training, or the question of horse training, with this lens, and to basically observe what has shifted in my perception and what is interesting to observe when our perspective changes or widens, rather, I must say.
And I'm excited about that because that, for me, I think summarizes who I'm drawn to talking to and why. Is I'm open and I'm curious about folks whose perceptions have changed over time. Certainly mine has changed a lot over time. I've talked about this in various podcasts with other folks. And so I always get very excited around this liminal space of transition between believing one thing and then having some sort of growth and change process, and then coming to this other place and seeing things from a different vantage point because of our own growth and our own healing, which is sort of what influences, who I'm drawn to talking to. And as you know, I talk with people from all sorts of walks of life in terms of horsemanship method or approach or perspective. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today, and also excited that you've had a similar journey of, oh, I came from over here and then I learned a bunch of things and healed a bunch of things and then continue to learn and heal. And how is that evolving, and how is that affecting, how I perceive things and intervene? So this is
Yeah,
wonderful.
it's beautiful that you're mentioning this. I really love what you're saying about evolution, because that's really what's happening. And one of the things that has been really become very important for me is to not try to state final conclusions or say that what we are discovering is the truth, because things are constantly evolving. And I am a constant student of life. And as we go along on this journey, we learn, we discover, we experiment, and really this space of experimentation without looking for the answer, that has really become a very rich journey and experience. Because it keeps us curious, like you say, it keeps us looking, and it keeps us observing. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's that quote I remember hearing a long time ago that I've always loved, which is, if you think you're green, you'll grow. If you think you're ripe, you'll rot. Which I really, really love. You know, it really speaks to that beginner's mind, right? Like, you know, you can know a lot of things and have a lot of life experience, and there's still so much more to know and grow and learn about and make mistakes with, and so on. And so it's very humbling, and also I think exciting, because if we hold that frame of beginnerness, even if you've been at it for a long time, I think that's where we're open to seeing what else might come forward that we're not noticing in terms of nuances or little things that might not have caught our attention previously that are so important.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I have discovered is when we go about things with the beginner's mind, is that we are going about it automatically with like in a slow down mode. And this is something that we are talking about in somatic experiencing and in EQUUSOMA, is that what happens when we slow things down. And I have discovered very often that things emerge by themselves, like answers emerge, or even, you know, like situations with the horse emerge when we just wait and we ask the question. And then we continue observing, and we continue to be curious, and we witness what's going on.
Yeah.
So it's been a beautiful process, and I'm so glad that we share so many of these things.
So thanks, Ines. And for those of you who don't know about somatic experiencing, so this is one of the therapeutic modalities that we'll be referring to over the course of this interview. Ines and I are both trained in somatic experiencing. It's based on the works of Dr. Peter Levine, who he himself also is drawing from a number of different sources, including ethology and indigenous healing practices and medical biophysics and psychophysiology. And so he's drawing from a number of different areas of knowledge in creating this method of trauma resolution, so to speak. And there's a lot of principles that come from somatic experiencing that we find very, very helpful in informing horse-human relationships and understanding of horse trauma, and how to adapt techniques in a way that takes the nervous system into consideration. And the EQUUSOMA training also looks a lot at attachment. Ines, as you and I both know, we look at a lot of attachment theory, and we take sort of behaviourism, which looks at sort of the classical sort of 4 quadrants of operational learning, operational conditioning, and sort of go beyond that. Because, you know, if we stay, like you were saying earlier, this idea of technique, I think in our previous conversations that we've had, you know, this idea of, well, there's technique and then there's what surrounds the technique. And if we get too sort of lodged into this camp or this camp or this camp, you know, then, and we miss the bigger picture, then there's a lot of nuance that might be really helpful that we're not attending to because we're so focused on technique. And we'll get a little bit into that over the course of the day, but those of you who've heard me speak before, I've talked about how I'm really big at looking what's beyond behaviourism. And so, yes, there's natural horsemanship with its, you know, reliance largely on negative reinforcement. And then there's going to be those who are into clicker training and positive reinforcement. Clicker training is but one version of positive reinforcement. And then there's all sorts of adaptations within that with differential reinforcement and counter conditioning and all sorts of different things there. And and those are all important things to know about how to do well. I think it really behooves us to know how to do these things well and at what timing, and if we look at the trajectory of human psychology and human psychotherapy, we're no longer in just the realm of behaviorism. So much has exploded beyond that since the decades of behaviorism. And so I feel like it's time that we bring this knowledge back around to when behaviorism is applied to animals. How are we looking at attachment and the nervous system and what's going on with thresholds and all sorts of other layers of nuance that haven't consistently been brought into a more behavioral lens. And so it'll be fun today, Ines, talking to you about your project. One of the main reasons that I wanted Ines on the show, if we could consider this a show, is that she has been working over the last few months with a number of other women to looking at trauma in horses, and how do we start to navigate a space around holding the conditions for relationships to unfold and for recovery to unfold beyond just horsemanship technique or behaviorist technique or whatever the thing is that you're using. And so I really wanted to bring Ines on into this interview so we could hear more about the project she's been working on, some of the key takeaways, and talk about that from the standpoint of certainly operant conditioning, but also what's beyond that. There's so much more nuance that I find these other trauma therapies have to offer. And the thing that has driven me in my work has been, especially since getting trained in somatic experiencing, but it's by no means the only trauma therapy I'm trained in. I'm trained in a number of other ones as well, such as EMDR and brain spotting, deep brain reorienting, all of which are very much based in neuroscience of mammalian emotion, not just human. But also parts work and working with somatic touch and so on. And so all of these inform my understanding of what's happening. And SE especially, I find, because it's grounded in mammalian psychophysiology, those are big words, but SE is based in ethology, which is the study of organisms under natural and optimal conditions. And then psychophysiology, which is this understanding of how emotions and the body intersect and feed into each other. And when we look at these pieces, it's interesting to me how we are using these areas of knowledge that are mammalian based to help us understand trauma recovery in humans, but we're not always applying the same knowledge to the animals, even though these perspectives were grounded in animal ethology and to a certain degree mammalian psychophysiology. And so it feels like a weird gap to me that we draw on animal models to understand human trauma and how to work with it, but then we're not using that with the animals. We seem to be really stuck in behaviorist mode, like we haven't taken this back around consistently yet. And so I'm not saying let's all bash behaviorism. I think it's a really important thing to know how and when to use that properly. And there's so much more going on out there that we need to know about. And so I'm so excited to have this interview with you today, Ines. So would you be willing to share a little bit more about this project that you've been working on?
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically, since the beginning of the year, I have dedicated quite some time to experiment with some other people, and particularly one young horsemanship trainer. She's been here now 3 months. Her name is Maureen Ferdemann, and she's German. And we have opened a lot of spaces almost on a daily basis to observe the horses that live here in my place, the place of grace. I have about 20 horses here, or equines, one donkey, one mule, but a big herd of horses. And we went in with the question of, like how to find a good balance between using some of the behaviorism and also exploring some of these other spaces, and to really find out what is key and important to apply, and like what are the conclusions that we can make and what are the conclusions that are dangerous to make, because sometimes we get stuck on those as well. So one of the things that I really like that you were saying is that you were talking about relationship, and I think what we can come back to, which sounds maybe very basic, but we are beings, we are relational beings, and we cannot not relate. And every equation that we are experiencing, relationship plays a role. So no matter how, like experienced we may be in a certain method or a technique, there is a number of other factors that play into each situation that may make the technique more successful or not. And unless we really get curious about those elements, it will be difficult to really go beyond, beyond the behaviorism. And this common denominator that is between, that we find between all methods, that is the component of relationship, and also the knowledge and the awareness that trauma also shows up in every equation. So we cannot be with the horse and reduce our interaction to technique only or to method only. It just isn't realistic, because the experience that we're having in this moment, the way we feel, the way our biorhythm is going, what happened just before, and like where we are with our lives, all play into this equation. And then of course what's happening for the horse too. So
it's funny that you're saying this, Ines, because as you're chatting, you're talking about what's coming up for the horse and the horse's nervous system, and my dogs are reacting to something outside of the window. And I think what it is that the Canada geese are returning because it's spring. And so there's a whole bunch of geese outside the window. And so they're having this response. So it's just funny timing, because I'm like, guys, it's okay. It's just geese. But they're having this response, and so it's just funny timing that you're talking about this nervous system stuff for the horses and how are we tracking that. And my dogs are doing a really great job of demonstrating exactly that piece. So I just wanted to speak to that. Anyway,
well,
my apologies.
Yeah, that's lovely how these things show up.
Yeah.
And also, like, what we need to take into consideration when we start to know about nervous systems is that with each individual that we're with, each horse and each human has a different nervous system. And so I can use the best developed technique and exercise, like if I'm following it to the letter, it may work for one animal, but not for the other. And it's the same for humans. So growing beyond the frame of technique and exercises, to me has become like evident that this is something that we need to do, particularly given that there is so much trauma in this space between horses and humans, just the way you said, like we learn from mammalian neuroscience and then we don't apply it. And I have come to know quite a lot of horses who have experienced severe trauma because of humans and domestications. And one of another observation that I've been making over the years is that the horse world itself is a huge mirror of the collective trauma that we have as humans. So by looking at these things and adapting our approach with horses to something that is more attuned, is a terminology that we like in somatic experiencing as well. And it really means that I am observing and taking into consideration of what is happening in the nervous system of the other and adapting my approach. Mm-hmm. Because I may want to be doing an exercise, but maybe the horse isn't ready for that. And how would I notice? Maybe there is too much activation about something so that I cannot just do the exercise. And me noticing that is an opportunity to be attuned in the relationship and to say something like, I see you and I see what's going on for you. And then wait and see what happens when I hold that space. And I really like what Dan Siegel says about relationships, about the fundamental needs, is that we would all like to be seen, feeling felt, and getting gotten. And that I find is also true for horses. And how do we do that is an interesting question, because they don't quite communicate like humans. And at the same time, I have experienced that when we open up these spaces with them, there is a lot of regulation that can happen at their end. So if I just go in with the curiosity and I say, I think this is what I'm seeing, and then I wait for the response, and then I can very often observe that the horse's nervous system is somewhat regulating down.
So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of regulation. So when we're looking for regulation in the animal, and we're holding this bigger frame about feeling felt and getting gotten, which is language I use a lot with people, but also with horses. Like, how do you perceive, or when you've been doing this project with the horses at your facility, what role has it been for the human to look into their own regulation and into their own experience of their own nervous system in the experience? Like, what have you noticed has been important about that piece? Because I think this is a piece that often isn't attended to. Like you're saying, is hey, there's this technique, let's do this exercise, or let's use this method. But the human's nervous system, the human's attunement, the human's stuff that's coming up isn't always taken into consideration. It's just the method. You know, and sometimes you'll hear some coaches talk about, well, you know, you need to make sure you're regulated, do this breathing strategy. But at the end of the day, that might not be, I mean, there's a difference between doing some sort of thing like a breathing strategy to down-regulate your nervous system if you're feeling a bit too activated. But then there's also, that in some ways can be like a temporary solution that is masking another underlying problem. If you're constantly activated in a particular way in response to a particular behavior, then there's something happening for the human that needs to be looked at as well. So I'm curious if you could speak more about that and how your exploration has been with your animals and with these women.
Yeah, and I really love that you're bringing this up, because that's another one of the observations that I have been making over the last couple of years, is that whenever we interact with horses, our stuff comes up inevitably, because there's no way for us to enter a relationship that we don't touch some of the things that preoccupy us. When we approach a horse with an intention, I find it very helpful to really be aware of what my intention is, and to ask the question also, why is it that I want to go there? And then, you know, like the question that you're asking with regards to regulation, will bring me into a space where there will be moments where I'm not regulated, and that will influence the horse. So for example, when I intend to do something that I don't feel comfortable with, it could be, for example, setting a boundary to a horse, you know, like that would require for me to mobilize some energy, and maybe my own trauma history will not allow me to do that comfortably, or I might not even be able to do it at all. And then what tends to happen a lot is also that people then blame the horse for something that's happening in an equation like this. So I'm unable to be clear and to be regulated and to be maybe assertive or whatever the situation requires. And then I'm blaming it on the horse and saying, okay, this is not working because the horse is not okay. But really what I need to look at is my stuff.
I love that you mentioned that. There was a study that came out. I was at the International Society for Equitation Science conference in 2019, and there was a presentation. We'll put this in the description of this video below, so you can have access to this particular study. But they did a study looking at the use of whips in various equestrian disciplines. and social license to operate. And this idea of, is the whip usage ethical, so to speak? And what was really fascinating was the more the whip was used, it didn't increase performance or make performance better. Things were not actually going very well at all. And so there was increased whip usage in spite of that. And so the question was asked, I think, and I may be sort of misremembering this, but to the best of my memory, was, well, what was the function of the whip usage if it wasn't actually improving performance? And the question that came out of it was, well, is it something about the human getting to save face? Oh, this is going wrong. I don't want to have the embarrassment or the shame of looking like I messed up in front of this whole international audience of people who are watching me. And so I'm going to make it look like I'm doing everything I can to make this better by being, leaning into the whip on my horse. And if things still don't work out well, it's not because I wasn't trying, it's because of the horse's failure. And so the use of the whip often ends up being more reinforcing for the human, because not just because of reinforcement, but this is an idea of shame, of shame and embarrassment and showing up in the world in a very particular way. And part of high-level sports, part of the trauma of high-level sports involves these sort of very public, vulnerable moments of failure and embarrassment and public shaming. And then there's the public shaming of having used the whip excessively, but there's almost like the precursor shame of, oh gosh, I don't want to look like I'm incompetent. And so core shame drives the use of the whip. And then there's additional shame on top of the fact that I now use this whip. And so it becomes really messy. So I think that would be an interesting example of what you're talking about, is our stuff comes up and then influences how we respond to the animal. And then we see what we might call in psychotherapy a trauma reenactment, right? Where there's a very familiar pattern showing up in a different circumstance of life. Where this particular pattern may actually be very familiar and very long-standing and may have much earlier roots in that person's history around, oh, I'm about to become embarrassed and I might feel this pang of dread in my chest, or I might feel anxiety rising, and there might be a whole physiological response that then motivates a particular behavior to quell or to temper this frantic energy to try to prevent harm. Harm being social shaming or social, ridicule or judgment. And so I'm going to, gaslight my horse, and sort of deflect the attention or the responsibility or blame shift over onto the animal and make it that it's their fault so that I can not appear a particular way, and this is about this unresolved human stuff, So I think that's just a really interesting example of what you're speaking about, Ines.
Absolutely, and thank you for naming that. Also, what I have observed is that most people, when coming into contact with a horse and horse training and getting the horse to do something, puts us in touch with some sort of performance anxiety or the need to demonstrate that I can control the horse or that I can do what needs to be done. And the failure of that connects to, like you say, the shame and the self-worth. Mm-hmm. And that is a very, very vulnerable place that is often underestimated. And also, what can be observed in many techniques and methods is that there's one person who is maybe the founder of the method, who is really great at it. And then people tend to idealize that person, put them on the pedestal, and all want to be like that person. And then feel worthless or unworthy or not good enough if they can't achieve something that they're idealizing. And that's definitely very present in the horse world. And it is, to me, really something that is very unrealistic, because if I want to be someone else than I am, like, I'm already setting myself up for failure.
Well, and this often sits on top of a lot of the early attachment stuff too. I mean, this is common with a lot of high level sports, not just equestrian sport, but the earlier that we get into a discipline, the earlier, we are taught that our worth is conditional. Love is conditional because I have to achieve, I have to win, I have to do something. And so I have to meet some sort of bar, in order to get the love and the approval of my parents, my coach, et cetera. And so oftentimes, for many people, this isn't true of everybody, but certainly a lot of people in high level sports, including equestrian disciplines, start very young, before they've had an experience of receiving love unconditionally or having attachment mechanisms really laid down in ways that feel really secure before having gotten into this high level sport, where now suddenly attachment, so to speak, is dependent on how I perform. And so there can be this real overcoupling of self-worth with security of relationship, with wanting to appease and to please, and performance anxiety. And it creates this little cluster, that for some people runs very, very deep, especially if there's early history of parental misattunement or caregivers not being emotionally available or what have you. And so it's just really, it can become a really interesting thing, with regards to all of that, so.
And the phenomena that we're describing here then leads to a very particular view that humans have on a horse. That is full of projection, of concepts, of expectation. And we no longer see the horse for who she really is. Mm-hmm. And I have often seen the difference between people who come to my workshops that are not related to any equestrian discipline, but that are more self-exploration and self-development oriented. And there's a big difference between people who are from the horse world, who are equestrians, and people who are not. So it just shows how powerfully conditioned we can be in a particular discipline, and how that really makes us narrow-minded. And for the horses, the things that I capture in animal communication, which is one of the things I also add into the equation, is that the horses have many times expressed that the way we view them, with our projection, with our expectation, and with our want, like we come and we want, like that is very imprisonating for them.
Did you notice how the hands just did this right now as well? And if you slow it down, Ines, I'm just curious, if you connect with that action, what do you notice happens in your body if you slow down that movement and connect with the want? Where do you feel the want inside?
Well, there is like a draw in my arms.
Okay, yeah.
That goes forward, and at the same time, there's a pang in my chest.
Pang in the chest, yeah. And if you hang out with the pang, what do you notice? What comes into your awareness if you sit with that sensation? Yeah.
Yeah, I connect with some pain and sadness.
Yeah.
Because me too, I have been in a place where I was like that towards the horses. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know better, because me too, I was conditioned by the equestrian world that I grew up with. And only later in my life, I started to question these things.
Yeah.
And today I'm at peace with having made this experience, for it has really pushed me also in the opposite direction. And that's true for many of us. So to really contact these places where we have maybe done things that were unjust. And then we notice, and we come in touch with the pain and the shame.
Yeah. And that's hard, because so many of us haven't done the work, or don't have the capacity, or don't like being shamed by its very nature is something you don't want to sense or feel. It's uncomfortable for a reason. And so if Ines and I are naming this idea of connecting with shame or connecting with guilt, you know, it's coming from this real place of compassion and understanding that we too make mistakes, and we too have made mistakes and will continue to make mistakes. You know, it's inherent in our human nature. And often it's important to recognize what we've had to do to survive. You know, if you've entered into a high level sport at a young age, it's okay, Troners, I know the geese are still there, aren't they? If you've entered into a high-level sport at a young age and then adopted sort of the methods of the authority figure in order to gain approval, I mean, that's just part of social survival, right? And so sometimes we've had to do things to survive within a particular society or a particular culture or a particular structure or a particular discipline or what have you, in order to survive within that structure or that context. And it's not necessarily indicative of who we truly are as individuals, but what we've had to do based on what we knew at the time and based on our development. And so we say this with a lot of care and understanding and appreciation for the fact that, yeah, some of these things do put us up against our own survival mechanisms. An example would also be equestrian accidents. Falls and so on that occur within equestrian sport, and how many people have had to override you know, an accident just to continue to perform. And this is certainly true with other sort of high level sports, but certainly especially within equestrian disciplines where falls are common, collisions are common, you know, things that create fear, because equestrian accidents are often high speed, high impact, and are overwhelming to the nervous system and can create shocks to the body that can result in brain injury, spinal injury, soft tissue injury, and subsequent anxiety and fear. And how many people wind up having to override a fair amount of that just to get back in the saddle, even though medically they may have been cleared, they may still have a residual sense of fear or activation that they may not be able to place, that can start to influence the experience with the horse, and wonder what's going on. Why is something different? If they haven't had a chance to necessarily renegotiate that fall or, you know, help deactivate following that experience, that leftover charge can still remain in the body. And if there's any kind of performance anxiety already, Ines, that you're talking about because of these other pieces, and then layer on top of that falls, impacts, etc., high speed sort of collisions, accelerousal, which is a new concept that's being talked about now in the literature around the anxiety that gets felt as we accelerate, usually in regards to motor vehicles, but certainly can occur within the equestrian world as well. How many horses experience accelerousal? I'm not sure. How many humans experience accelerousal? And then layer this on top of everything else, and you've got a lot of stacking that can create you know, a lot more to overcome. And so it's no wonder that we start to see situations where the human's nervous system is holding a lot, the horse's nervous system is holding a lot. And then we have these situations where there's escalation occurring. And then what are the solutions? Well, at this point, the odds are like there's so much stacked against us that I have to resort to these really, you know, perhaps abusive methods to try to gain control, when in reality we've missed all these thresholds. There's so many things that have been occurring without the opportunity to deactivate, and we would call that stimulus stacking. Some people call it trigger stacking. I tend to avoid the word trigger stacking for the main reason that trigger, as you and I know, Ines, being psychotherapists, triggers usually have a very particular definition within the trauma literature, and not everything is necessarily a trauma trigger. Right. And so you could have stimulus stacking being noise in the environment that is particularly aggravating. It's not traumatic. It's not part of a trauma trigger, but it's a stimuli into an already stacked system that's carrying a lot. And so this idea of trigger stacking, or what we call stimulus stacking, is there's all these stimuli and things that the nervous system's having to manage. And then we get to the point where it becomes too much. And if that's happening for the human and for the horse, you know, it can become really complicated.
And that really leads me to the thought of rupture and repair. It's almost like there is like rupture and repair on a long cycle, you know, like as we become aware of this and as we become aware of the stacking, and certainly that's an experience that I've made. And I have one horse, Miley, she's now 27 and she's been with me 25 years. So she's really experienced me when I was a very ambitious equestrian and when I was very demanding on horses, and when I was somewhat in a way of stacking, even it wasn't maybe so much the fear of an accident, but definitely the fear of failure. And there was a lot of rupture. So I was really overriding my own boundaries and I was overriding her boundaries. And as we become aware of that, and as we are willing to open up to receive what's going on and to see it, we have the opportunity for repair. And how does that look? Is that when we take a step back and we, now that I'm talking about that, I'm taking a deep breath. And I'm very lucky that Miley is still around because I had many opportunities of repair with her. And now when I look at her today and I see her today and the way I look through a very, very different lens, I'm really grateful that I'm able to experience that with her on a daily basis. Because this is where we are repairing not only for ourselves and not only for our own horse, but we are repairing for the collective, and we are repairing for the entire equestrian world. And this is something that in our day and age is coming more into our awareness, is that as we are connected, not only we're not separated individuals, but we are connected to everything. And that the trauma that we're experiencing is also not just ours, but there's a lot of transgenerational trauma in humans and horses and the collective field of the horse industry. Is that each time, you know, like, okay, maybe I had to relive some of these traumas myself. And at the same time, now I'm getting the opportunity to repair. And I have the capacity to do that. So I dedicate a fair amount of my life to do that because it's meaningful to me. And I know a lot of people who do the same. And this is true for other areas as well. And particularly, I find it powerful with the horses because horses are, in a way, the interspecies connection between horses and humans is ancient, maybe more than with any other animal. Or, you know, like we can't quite compare because probably without horses, we wouldn't have never conquered the world. So all the trauma that has happened between the species, like there was one moment when I was in a workshop opening spaces, and the horses drew an image, and it was like a constellation where they showed us that between in this interspecies field between human and horse, there is a tremendous wound. It's a terrible wound. And every single interaction that we have with them and they have with us contributes to either get this wound getting bigger and worse, or to getting smaller and heal. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very moved by this image. And I realized how powerful we all are, because with each interaction that we have with them, we can decide, you know, which way to go. So, you know, like I'm kind of talking a little bit about the motivations, but really like the idea is to talk about, yes, there is rupture and it's inevitable in trauma. And because we are all born into a traumatized world, to some extent, we cannot avoid it. We're all concerned, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's not about not having trauma. It's the way we deal with it and the way we repair, and that we have choice. We have choice to do that. At least most people do.
And then there's the question of what choices are available. And so within that, you know, we want to recognize that as well. The question that I find really important here is how do we recognize what we're not seeing? which is so hard because when you're in it, you don't see it, right? People, and so then when suddenly you start looking at it through this lens, you can't unsee it ever again, right? And like you said, intergenerationally, I mean, horses that are in captivity have usually, for the most part, been weaned far too young. I mean, how many horses in captivity don't have some form of developmental rupture where they were weaned too young? And then their circumstances, the captivity conditions have not been ideal. Certainly horses have had to adapt to human, westernized, for the most part, sort of captivity conditions, colonized captivity conditions. And so, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily all faring well, and so sometimes what we're seeing, the behaviors that we're seeing are evidence of the captivity conditions. And so you have generation upon generation upon generation of horse being bred to horse, being bred to horse. And these things get passed down. We see this with human populations as well, and so I think of thoroughbred horses that are bred for a particular trait, for a particular capacity. And then they're raised and they're ridden, they're backed very, very young before their bone structures have had a chance to fully develop, and we've got these horses that are being euthanized at age 8, age 4, age 9, that they've already burned out. Their life expectancy is really short because of so much demand, both within the genetics and the intergenerational sort of breeding upon breeding upon breeding, and then how the handling and the management of these horses occurs generation after generation, and then what they're exposed to. And then this is what gets passed down. And then then certain species or certain breeds of horse, for instance, get bad reputations because of this sort of endowment, right, that gets passed along. And that's one version of it. And we see this kind of, and then we gaslight the horses and say, well, I don't want to work with this particular breed because of X, Y, and Z reason. And it's like, well, but how much of that reflects the captivity conditions and the breeding conditions and what we've selected for, that we've created to support human endeavor, and we see this with human populations as well, human populations that have experienced genocide or massacre or slavery or residential school, or, human populations that have had a lot of discrimination or collective trauma. And then within those populations, things continue to unfold when the conditions are not safe. And then we gaslight or blame shift those populations and go, well, what's wrong with you? And then we see things like racism emerge, right? Because of these perceptions, right? That there's something wrong with this population. And we see the same thing with horses. It's like, oh, we start blaming certain horses or certain breeds of horses for issues when in fact they may just be holding this collective, because of how they were bred and what they were exposed to. And then we get to conveniently blame that particular breed, for instance. And so trauma is really, really insidious. We see this in so many ways. This idea also of I'm trying to think of another example. There was something about the what you were saying earlier about human trauma and how that influences technique or horsemanship technique. So I'll give an example if I back it up. So my horse Brando had some unfortunate training methods applied to him by various trainers before I learned about all these things. And so he has, between that and his temperament, and he's a rather sensitive temperament. He's also very, he gets very stoic, and he will either tolerate, and then he'll get to a point where he can no longer tolerate, and then he'll be very opinionated. And so his nervous system thresholds are very interesting to learn about. And at one point we hit a moment where he wasn't wanting to stand at the mounting block. And I've shared the story about Brando before, where he wouldn't stand at the mounting block, didn't want to do it. And everyone kept saying, well, you need to use negative reinforcement. You've got to use your carrot stick, and give him the option between the pressure of the carrot stick or the rest at the mounting block. And I tried that for years and I wouldn't get anywhere. And people were like, well, you're not being forceful enough, or you're not releasing the pressure at the wrong time. I was releasing the pressure at the correct time. People were observing and providing input. And I was like, there's got to be more to this picture. And of course, I had had a trauma at the mounting block with my horse Brando, and I was putting weight on his back, and I wasn't wearing a helmet. I would never ride without a helmet. That's just my own safety precaution, but I was just putting weight on his back. And he spooked. The horses next to him in the adjoining paddock spooked, and he took off, and I wasn't super aware of my environment because I was over his back. I couldn't tell what was happening. It was very split second. I tumbled and fell off the back of him. And then moving forward, going to the mounting block was overcoupled with this experience for him and I. And so everyone was like, well, you need to get him to stand at the mounting block. You need to get him to pick between the mounting block where he gets to rest or this carrot stick. And I said, but that's a double bind, because now the mounting block is a location of trauma for myself. And now I have anxiety going towards the mounting block, and he feels that. And so now he has to pick between a rock and the hard place. It's not that the mounting block is this safe, comfortable place compared to the carrot stick. The mounting block now has, you know, negative emotion attached to it, because I feel stressed when I approach it. Even when I think I'm being calm, I'm actually probably being really stoic. And I'm trying to contain my activation while I come up to this mounting block, but he senses that. He knows that something happened at the mounting block. And so how do we fix this? You're not going to just fix it through using technique, because it's going to be a combination of what's happening for the human. I had to heal my mounting block trauma and deactivate that and help that clear from my nervous system, and then help Brando with that using a number of different things. And we came about it from the perspective of some somatic experiencing, looking at thresholds for him, and also doing some behavior shaping around the mounting block. And it didn't take very long before we got it resolved. I mean, it was what, 2 years of trying to get him to stand at the mounting block. And then we ended up repairing the issue by doing a combination of other things than just pressure release, because that was the wrong tool for the wrong moment, you know? And so if we come at it strictly from this idea, if I jump on what you were saying earlier of just technique without recognizing this other layer of what might be playing out, then we might just hit into frustration. And then, you know, and then we might be more inclined to get frustrated and go, well, this horse is, you know, just opinionated. And it's like, yes, but what is behind that resistance? There's a reason why there's an avoidance of wanting to stand quietly next to the mounting block, because there's activation in the nervous system, not just for the horse, but for me as well. And so it's more than just, well, use this technique to fix the problem. It's like, no, if we back this up in the sequence, there was a moment of shock and rupture that occurred. And now there's this reverberation of that shock and rupture within the human's nervous system, and the horse is pinging off of that, so to speak. And so how do we then work with the humans, what the human's body is carrying? And work with that level first. It's kind of, it reminds me a little bit of the ARC model, attachment, regulation, and competency that's used in helping children. If we have a child that's experienced trauma in the world or trauma in relationship, you work with the caregivers first. You work with the caregiver's attunement, the caregiver's regulation, the caregiver's capacity for recognizing their own stuff and working through the caregiver trauma. And then we work with the client, the child, for instance, because if the caregivers are still struggling, it's really going to be limited to work strictly with the level of the child when the caregiver system is struggling and is part of the world in which the child is trying to navigate. And so it's kind of a similar perspective. If the human owner or rider could be the equivalent of the human caregiver for a human child, and the horse is the child in that equation, not literally, but if we use the metaphor, then how are we helping the human to work through whatever trauma they're carrying so that they're approaching the situation with the horse from that place of greater clarity and clearing, so that the horse, then we have that much less in the horse's field to have to try to overcome. Right? It's kind of like what's being stacked. And if you heal the human's stuff that might be coming into the picture, that removes it from the equation or from the stacking pile. And so now we've got less to have to address. But if this is there, then we have to overcome that much more just to try to resolve the problem. And it's this idea of the horse as identified patient is language we use in psychology or psychotherapy. You know, the child is often the identified patient within the family, but really they're just reflective of the family system or the caregiver system and what's going on there. And so this isn't about pointing blame at the system or at the caregiver, but there is a lot of value in helping create the conditions. for something different to emerge. If I heal my trauma and work through my stuff, and I'm more deactivated and settled and have more spaciousness, then what might be different for the child, the youth, the partner, the horse, and then move from there and see what needs to be done. And so I just wanted to add that in because I think that, that's a really important piece.
Yeah, that's really beautiful that you're saying this. And that what you are describing may also lead to the necessity that we step away of what we originally wanted with the horse. And depending on the severity of the trauma, I mean, here that you with Brando, you managed to come to a place where the mounting block in the end was okay, and there was a repair around this. With some other horses, this may take considerably more time. Mm-hmm. And if we, as humans, remain stuck on the idea that we want to use the horse to ride or to do this or that, and we consider the horse as an object, this isn't working. So we really need to consider the horse as a significant other, so in some way, shape, or form, that we're in a relationship with. And in this equation, we're not getting, it's not like with a car or a tennis racket or something. This is really something we need to build, and that requires input from our side. And the input may require, like you say, that we clear our own things and that we attend to our own things first, and then see what is possible with the horse. So yeah, that's sometimes for some people really a challenge to let go of this view, because they have put money, they have put, like there is a lot of pressure maybe from their environment, where a lot of people, for example, who go for walks with their horses, there's other people who go like, what, you're not riding your horse, why is that? Well, you can do a lot of things with a horse when you're not riding. But this is also something that is just little by little coming into humans' mind when it comes to horses, because a big part of us, we're still very attached to the idea that you have a horse, you got to ride it. And yeah, I think we also need to go beyond that and see what else is possible and what other opportunities show up.
Yeah, and I will clarify what I just said, just because I hear this echoing in my mind. I also want to say that it would be very ableist to assume that if a human has a difficulty with mental health, that it automatically assumes the horse or the animal will have difficulty with mental health in that same area. So it would be a very ableist perspective to say, well, because you have mental health issues, you shouldn't have animals. And that's not what we're saying here, right? And so that's not the correct takeaway from what we're saying at this point. And so if you found yourself kind of feeling targeted in what we're saying, know that we're both in the same boat. Ines and I both have our own traumas and our own histories that have impacted our horses. And this is a common issue. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't have animals, right? And so it's the yes ands again. And there are some mental health difficulties that can lead to significant animal welfare difficulties. And so the two are true, right? One doesn't necessarily have to mean that the other will happen, but it can. And so we're really wanting to encourage this sort of broader perspective, not about punitiveness towards people for, difficulties that might be beyond their control, but also recognizing, and we have a responsibility as best as we can to attend to how we may be influencing the experience, right? As opposed to, well, this means this, therefore, certain individuals should not have animals. And that's not what we're saying here. So in case you were thinking or feeling that, that's not the angle that we're coming from. It's more nuanced than that, So somebody could have, say, difficulties with anxiety. That doesn't mean that their animal suddenly has an anxiety issue, right? It can happen, certainly. We've seen this with families, within families, where parents whose nervous systems may be more anxious, children may, in response to that, develop more anxiety because they're learning from that caregiver's nervous system, right? So that can happen, but this isn't about blame, right? This is more about recognizing, hey, how do we as mammals resonate off of each other, and what are the impacts of that, intended or not, right? As opposed to, well, this happened, therefore this person should not X, Y, and Z. So we're not coming at this from a very rigid perspective, but more of holding a broader frame around, around these pieces, because certainly folks who have difficulties with emotion or mental health or have experienced trauma are often drawn to animals, because they feel so regulated and safe around them, and often can be different with animals than they are with people. And so this is why we hold this broader frame. So please understand that when we're sharing about this, it isn't about blaming or about penalizing or painting everybody who has difficulties with the same broad brushstroke. So this is more about the nuances of when it is part of the equation, when it is in the field, and it is a contributing factor, then how can we support that gentle awareness for the humans and the horse's recovery, as opposed to it being about, oh, well, there's something wrong with you, therefore that's, you shouldn't have animals. And that's not at all what we're promoting here. I just wanted to clarify that.
And thank you for being so specific on this, Sarah, because I find this very important. Because if we are opening up to this broader view, there's a lot of opportunity for both us and the horses. And there's the most beautiful stories that can come out of that. So the invitation is really to open up and to be more relaxed about what the outcome might be, because we don't quite know. And to really make the journey count, and the experience that we're having with ourselves and the horse, and really consider it as a learning and as an opportunity for repair for both.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I'm wondering, would you be willing to share some examples from your experiment with your horses and your mule and your donkeys at your facility over the last month and a bit that you've been playing with, in terms of, because I know you have a number of rescued animals, some of which come with significant trauma, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the discoveries or the curiosities that you've had as a result of these experiments that you've had around healing. Setting these conditions for healing. Yeah.
Absolutely, with pleasure. So the first example that I would like to share is the example of a young horse who hasn't experienced significant trauma. And she's a 5-year-old mare. Her name is Samaya. And together with Maureen, we started to, what's the best way to put this in terminology? In English, you would probably say the process of starting a horse instead of breaking in. I much prefer that. So of starting the horse under the saddle. So that was the idea, but without, it being us being super attached, but just to experiment, because Maureen has gone through a horsemanship school that proposes a very systematic approach of how to prepare the horse for this experience. Mm-hmm. And that includes that certain exercises are being repeated very often. Mm-hmm. So together we started to go into the process and we started to observe. And what we observed rather quickly is that the repetition of the exercises were not very comfortable for the horse. We started to feel that she was getting bored very easily, because, okay, it's the same thing. And Maureen was very contained with her emotion. So she was very focused and concentrated and just repeating the exercise. And the horse wasn't showing the signs of, really being relaxed and really being content, but rather being a bit tense and, also showing a little bit of, sometimes the ears back when, oh, now you're asking me to do this again. Mm-hmm. And so one of the findings that we had when we started to experiment with more, do the exercise less and just pause and focus more on the relationship. Mm-hmm. By standing, breathing, talking, using a lot of voice, when the horse does something well, use a tone like, ah, okay, great, that makes the very fine tissues vibrate. And we noticed that was actually much more successful with this mare than repeating the exercises over and over and over again. So she would remember them a lot more easily. So that is one example of how relationship can be more important than the technique. because she had understood the exercises quite easily. And what she was looking for, I had the impression, was really this contact. And that's where she was finding something rewarding and pleasant. And she was seeking to find this attuned place with the human, where the human is going like, ah, okay, this is great. Thank you for doing what I'm asking you.
So there's more of that relational sort of back and forth, as opposed to we're now going to do this set of steps and this manualized sort of, okay, we're going to do A, B, C, and D. And then at the end of it, we're going to have a horse that can have a saddle on its back. It's more about this relational process of, hey, I'm attending to you and I'm noticing you, I'm here with you. And also I'm assuming for the trainer, having more of that, think of more ventral vagal or more social engagement available, which is about that communicating in a relational way, as opposed to a mechanical, we're just going to do these things over and over again. So there's a sense of presence attending at a different layer than just the task. I like how you said it, it's this horse in this moment, in this context, on this day, is what is the animal needing in this moment, as opposed to, well, we have this manualized set of instructions and this is how you apply X, Y, and Z technique. And we're just going to do this technique without recognizing the context and the things that are surrounding the experience and what's coming up in that moment, in this moment here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another question we were exploring with this mare was, how do you find safety? And like in a sense, like, how do I feel secure enough? So when is the right moment to try a first ride, for example? And what we concluded as well is that, again, the attunement and the relationship matter the most, because I can get the horse to stand still at the mounting block. If I repeat it sufficiently often and the horse isn't traumatized, most horses will learn that relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. But the question of how regulated the horse is in that moment is key. Because if I don't pay attention to that and I only pay attention to the technique, so is the horse responding to my cue when I tap with the stick on the back? Mm-hmm. And the horse is moving a step forward and is stopping at the mounting block. That doesn't tell me yet about the horse's regulation and about my regulation when I'm attempting to get on the horse's back. Mm-hmm. So what we were observing as well is that plays a really fundamental role. So again, repeating the exercise over and over again was not necessarily leading to the horse being very regulated, somewhat calm, but not in connection. So not as ventral vagal as it could be when we started to stand at the mounting block and breathe and involve touch and voice and wait for the horse to come down and me too. Mm-hmm. And then prepare safer conditions for me to attempt a first ride.
I love this distinction between like the felt sense of safety, and certainly Dr. Stephen Porges talks a lot about that idea of the feeling of safety is the treatment. And safety isn't just this absence of danger or absence of threat. Safety feels a particular way in the nervous system. And so when a nervous system is feeling safe, that feels different. That feels more expansive. There's warmth, there's engagement, there's curiosity, there's all these things that are possible when we're in that particular state of the nervous system. And how do we get there? Because that will allow different things to emerge differently and perhaps more easily than if the nervous system is in a different state. And so we just finished teaching EQUUSOMA last week to another round of Fundamentals 1 students. And we were talking about precisely this, as you know, Ines, we teach this in the model, which is that distinction between safety rules and the felt sense of safety. You can apply all the safety rules in the world. Don't stand behind a horse. Don't wrap the rope around your hand. Don't run by the animal, and these rules are in place for a reason. I mean, they're helpful, and they're overall good rules. And at the same time, if we just stay at the level of the rules and we're not attending to how I feel safe with the horse or the horse feels safe with me, And if we are both not feeling safe with each other, those safety rules may not be enough to overcome what is in the space between the horse and the human. There may still be an incident or an accident that occurs because we're in this nervous system place of not feeling safe with one another. And so at the end of the day, sometimes those safety rules aren't enough to overcome the felt sense of unsafety. And so this is why we're shifting out of, okay, yeah, these mechanical perspectives and looking at, okay, well then how can I tell if the horse feels safe with me? Do I feel safe with the horse, or am I overriding a whole bunch of stuff in order to show up and look like I'm in control or save face amongst the other people at the barn, for instance? You know, do I truly feel safe with this animal? And if not, then how do we start there? You know, like said, Dr. Susan Friedman talks about the humane hierarchy. And before you get into any kind of technique to fix the problem, you want to look at health and wellness and all these things. But then you also want to, what's the word called, arrange the antecedents, which we call setting the conditions. And part of those conditions is what's going on for the human. If the human's nervous system is not feeling safe with the horse, and they're in a nervous system state that isn't feeling comfortable, and the horse is not feeling safe with that human, and then we've got that as an issue, and then try to fix a problem that's stacked on top of this other thing, and then you've got more to have to overcome. And so I like this idea of safety, like how are we feeling safe with one another? Because that will set a very different tone for what's wanting to emerge, whether what is being used is clicker training or other forms of positive reinforcement or differential reinforcement or counter conditioning or negative reinforcement, pressure release stuff, like regardless of what it is that you're using, like part of that setting of those conditions involves that neuroception of safety. And how can you tell if the nervous systems feel safe with each other?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's beautifully put, and it's super helpful to be very specific on that, I find. And maybe another example I could share is I have a 5-year-old mule. She's only been here since last November, so it's quite recent. And she had a very traumatic start into her life. I don't know all the details of her story. What I do know is that she comes from Spain, and Spain unfortunately has a bit of a reputation to have very traumatizing training methods. And so a lady in Germany bought this mule from Spain, or got her offered as a gift. And when the mule arrived in Germany, she wouldn't let anyone approach her and nor get haltered, nothing. And this lady then contacted Maureen as a trainer, and Maureen started to work with the mule and started to see that there is actually a lot of scars that she has around her head. You know, as soon as she started to get closer to her, she has also her tongue is half cut through from the bit. So we can make a couple of educated guesses of what happened. Also, she changed owner like 7 times. That's in the passport when she's only 5 years old. So Maureen did an amazing job of getting her to tolerate the process of haltering and get her to tolerate even the pad and the cinch and the handling, giving all the feet, etc., to put her in a best possible position to go back to the owner. Unfortunately, the owner didn't participate in the process and didn't know all the codes and cues, and was probably herself not in a very regulated state to handle the mule. And then she decided to give her away. And that's how she came here. Now, ever since Enya is her name, ever since Enya has been here, we did try a couple of different things. Now, what we've observed first is that with consistent training methods, techniques, you can get even a very traumatized animal to tolerate certain things. Now, you know, like she can tolerate to get haltered. She would even get saddled. But is she really okay with that? I was wondering.
Tolerating is the word here that I'm really hinging on as I'm hearing you speak.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear where this goes. Yeah.
So I noticed very quickly, like Maureen brought her to me in November and then went back to Germany with the idea to come back in January. So I had a couple of like weeks with her by myself, and I started to ask all these questions, and I started to notice that if I don't apply the technique just the way she was taught, she would say no. Mm-hmm. And to me, I wanted to go further and explore what else was possible. So I started to propose things that were entirely based on consent. So I would really approach her very slow and really offer touch at a distance, which at some point was something she would tolerate, not tolerate, but actually like, enjoy. And she would seek.
Between the tolerating, would you speak to that? So there's the tolerating, and then there's tolerating, and then there's like a true yes. And I'm wondering how you could tell the difference for the mule, for Enya.
Yeah, so when she would tolerate something, you can tell that she's letting you do it, but she's tense.
Okay, right.
And you know, like in her nervous system, you can see her eye is kind of wide, and you know, like her muscle is tense and her head is slightly up. And she would allow me to halter her, and I can sense that if I would give her a choice, she would say no. Mm-hmm. Versus, you know, like appreciating and accepting is really like being entirely relaxed and fully welcoming what I'm doing. Like, for example, the touch at a distance, you know, like lower her head, close her eyes, lick and chew, deep breathing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's the difference that I would make. And so a lot of things started to considerably improve with her through this relationship building that I started to do with her. And so now, since Maureen is back in January, we are trying to find the fine line between, so because if we would accept her no, if we would accept her no, you know, like we wouldn't halter her and we wouldn't take care of her feet, we wouldn't take care of certain other things that I feel responsible for if it's my animal. And so we feel like it's okay to ask her to tolerate some things, and then to see if we can create a corrective experience out of that, meaning that
you do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how we would do that is that, for example, we ask her to halter her and then do what we can to make it pleasant for her. So if she would tolerate to be haltered, you know, for example, I would just stand there, breathe, and engage in some sort of contact that she really likes, for example, scratching. Mm-hmm. There are certain parts of her body that she would allow to touch, not allow, but which she appreciates, you know, like when I rub her. Mm-hmm. And then take the halter off and let her integrate. Mm-hmm. And with the idea that she will hopefully make sufficient corrective experience so that she will no longer have such an adverse reaction to the haltering. Mm-hmm. And what we've observed is that it hasn't quite gone away, you know, like her tendency to tolerate, but it has gotten a lot more soft. So I can still notice that she is somewhat, you know, like uncomfortable because probably there's just been so much trauma around this that it takes time to deconstruct, or how do you say, or to remodel, maybe rather. And there has been a lot of other things that we've observed that are quite interesting, is that Enya would not seek proximity with humans like out of her own initiative before she came here. Now, ever since we've been starting to do this like repair, she starts to, you know, like when nobody's walking around with a halter in their hand and an intention, she now decides out of her own initiative to come and explore the human with a lot of curiosity. Mm-hmm. So I have often people come to my farm and there's not at all in the context of haltering the horses or something, but just spend a lot of time being around them. And so what we've observed is that she, out of her own initiative, comes and she's almost like waiting, you know, like it's almost like, oh, there's a new human, and she immediately comes over and then she sniffs them from foot from head to toe, and she kind of starts to relax, and she starts to lick and chew a lot, standing next to people, and to really engage in some sort of contact, like as if she's suggesting something from her side. And for now, I have decided that this is just perfect. I'm not going to ask for now that she tolerates anything else. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, like sometimes I might decide to, okay, let's see if we can expand on this comfort zone a little bit and see how it goes, and let her also have a say in this.
The choice piece, I think, that I'm hearing about this is really, really crucial, you know, and others have talked about this as well, as, you know, what happens when you give the horse the opportunity to say no, or to say, you know, to have a pause, you know, is so important. A colleague of mine, Lauren Fraser, who's an equine behaviorist here in British Columbia, has written a really great blog post about giving horses a start button, where, you know, it's, and so you train the horse about what does the start button mean. You might use a little bit of clicker training and so on to help them understand that this is how you're going to communicate that when you're ready to go. To the human, so that so that we can understand each other. And the article is really interesting because it talks a little bit about this fear that if we give horses a choice, if we allow them to have a no, right, that they're going to suddenly not want to do anything for us anymore. And to me, I find that a very interesting fear, because I go, well, what does that tell you about your relationship with the animal? That if the relationship with the animal is non-existent, and that you're simply based on, you know, the animal complying with your requests, that if you started to give a no, that the animal would no longer comply with your requests. And that tells me there's something that needs to happen at the level of the relationship. And what Lauren has found, and that others have certainly found as well, is when you allow the choice to happen, when the horse gets to have a say at times, they're more willing at other times to offer a yes, because there's something about what they're saying that's being considered. And that consideration is so important. And that's part of that attunement and that relational piece. And it's not that we give 100% of the no's all the time. Certainly, like you said, there's times where we have to do stuff that's uncomfortable. And that's where I think things like the humane hierarchy come in, is like, okay, so we have to do this uncomfortable thing. What can we do as best as possible to set up the horse for success? So it's as least, to use the Lima principle, it says it's least invasive, minimally aversive as possible, so that we're doing the best we can. And so how do we set those conditions for this to unfold differently, right? We all have to do stuff that's uncomfortable, and we can either do it in a way that we're overriding and overriding and overriding and stacked and stacked and stacked, and then at some point we have an adverse reaction. Or we do it in such a way that as best as possible, we're attending to the relationship and the safety and the nuance and the no's and the, you know, and we're allowing that time. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. I've shared before with students about how my horse Brando, you know, when I used to live where I used to live, and he was at this particular facility, we lived in an area where there were a lot of veterinarians available. And so when Brando needed to get like a vaccine, for instance, or we were going to do his teeth, and he needed to have, you know, the sedation, again, through a vaccine, you know, we had to do some work to help him feel comfortable with the idea of a veterinarian coming and pinching his neck and administering the vaccine. And so I used, originally, before I learned all these things, I would just make him do it. You just override the horse's reaction and try to get it done as quickly as possible. And then I learned about all this stuff, and I was like, okay, so I thankfully had a veterinarian previously that was really open to this idea of, let's take our time, let's do some behavior shaping, let's do a little bit of clicker training, and help him explore each segment towards the experience. So like in somatic experiencing, we imagine the first tiniest segment in the sequence to the outcome that we're aiming for, and then we allow that to activate and deactivate before we continue. you know, at these little tiny exposures and deactivations of the nervous system before proceeding. And then we would pair that in with some clicks and some treats and to help him get used to it. So Brando got very, very good at receiving vaccinations. If you're hearing, my dog Trigger is dreaming. And so I don't know if you can hear his little noises, but he's having a dream right now. It's rather cute. he's having these little barks in his sleep. And so Brando got very, very good at doing this uncomfortable thing in a way that was much more pleasant for everybody, including him. You know, vaccines are not comfortable. I don't like vaccines. And we have to find ways to get through these experiences by minimizing harm or minimizing the intensity of it. And then I moved away and I moved to an area where there aren't a lot of veterinarians and they don't have the time to build a relationship and help the experience be less uncomfortable. And so we haven't been able to do that process. And so with my previous veterinarian, Brando, we would do it every time. And he would go, oh, okay, I know this person. And he would deactivate and receive the vaccination relatively smoothly. And we can't do that anymore. The veterinarians are more busy. They don't have as much time available. You know, it's you're booking months in advance, you know, and there's a lack of options. And so all those other steps that I normally would like to take to help make this experience less problematic are not always available. And so we're having to go to those more difficult options to get through the situation, not because I want to, not because that's the ideal, but because sometimes you don't have a choice. But it's this idea of what can you do? You know, where can you allow that choice wherever possible? You know, and I think that's what aiming for that, I think, is really, really crucial. You know, is can we set those conditions and to the best of our abilities? And then if not, then what's the most ethical way of proceeding? Even if it's not ideal, what's the best ethical option, you know? And so I love hearing that allowing of choice and that allowing of the no is so crucial.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for adding that. And do we have time for another example?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
So another one of the very young mares, Jasmine, has a very sensitive nervous system, meaning she's very easily activated and she's a very, you could say, jumpy horse. So you have her on the lead rope, you know, she will take 2 normal steps and then she kind of trots or jumps or, you know, like, and it's not necessarily a negative stress that she has. She just loves to move and to jump around. But also she would, with her own behavior, even when observing her on the pasture, she would often give herself a scare and drive her own nervous system out of her window of tolerance. You know, like, for example, she would be capable to pick up a branch from the floor and then realize, okay, there's leaves on it, and that scares her. And then she runs off, but she doesn't let go of the branch and then goes totally out of control all by herself because she's still dragging the branch along with her. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like, it's a little bit funny as well, her character. And what we notice is as well that when you have her on the lead rope and you're in the arena to do some groundwork, she would kind of do the same things. She would also kind of drive her own nervous system into more activation. Mm-hmm. And what we started doing is just to set boundaries and to do very short sequences to actually teach her how to, okay, don't go all that way. And what if you come back down now? And help mm-hmm. her with co-regulation, you know, to say, okay, now what if we wait for a moment before we do the next thing? Mm-hmm. And it was amazing of how she changed. So she was a very impatient, kind of very like jumpy also on the lead rope. And now she can just stand there and wait. And she's still very much in ventral capacity because she's constantly interacting. That's really, she's very gregarious. Like, she looks at you and then she wants to sniff a bit, and, you know, like, to allow all these things and to really like being in this contact with her 4 feet on the ground. And that was quite amazing to see how, you know, like with this horse in this moment, setting boundaries around, you know, like her jumping left, right, and center would really help her to better learn how to regulate herself and to make it safer, you know, like to establish cues so that she could understand, okay, now we're doing this. And it's almost as if she was grateful for some of the guidance that she was getting, because it helped her to manage herself and her high energy level in a better way.
That's a really lovely example. It speaks to like stimulus stacking, where she has a more sensitive nervous system. She startles easily, you know, that fear response kicks in, and then you clamp your jaw and you're in fear response. And so you can't unhinge the jaw when you're in fear to drop the scary object, you know. And I've certainly seen videos of that on YouTube where, and some of these videos unfortunately are shared from a sense of humor of, oh, look at this silly horse. And it's in reality, it's actually, no, that's a very scared horse that has clamped its jaw and can't release the scary object because it's now gotten a fear response. And so it's actually a rather unfortunate circumstance, you know, when these things happen. And so what I love hearing about this is that you have recognized those, what we might call pendulations, the activation, deactivation of the nervous system, and helping her to go, oh, okay, so when I activate, it doesn't have to keep stacking. It can actually come back down. You know, so for a horse that doesn't have a good brake system available, you know, it's like, how does that horse start to learn how to regulate and come down the other side, as opposed to keep escalating without there being any kind of interruption to that sequence. And so that's a really interesting sort of piece of work that you've done with her around, oh, instead of the stacking and the stacking, it's that completion of the deactivation, you know, and then it's like, oh, okay, it doesn't have to keep doing this, you know, it can actually come down. And this is different, I find, than I've had this conversation with others around teaching a relaxation cue, you know, because sometimes that can do the opposite effect, where the animal is activated or the human is activated. And then we just say, okay, now calm down, now do this thing to regulate yourself, do this breathing strategy, you know, do this whatever. And in reality, we haven't taught the nervous system, we haven't grown the window of tolerance, we've just downregulated. Right? We haven't actually grown the window. We've just helped the nervous system to find relaxation, but in reality, the patterning is still there. So introducing a grounding strategy isn't necessarily the same thing as helping the nervous system come peak and drop and come out the other side, and then feel that resolution, because that's the natural system or template of the nervous system is, oh, the nervous system will rise and fall. What goes up must come down. As opposed to, oh, it's up and now I'm going to force it to come down through some sort of mechanism. You know, there's a place for grounding tools or down regulation strategies, like lowering a horse's head, but sometimes those are misused or they're at the wrong time. You know, and what I think you're suggesting is a little different, Ines, is that, oh, it's that activation and then allowing it to sort of deactivate so that the template of the nervous system starts to be experienced. And that horse goes, oh yeah, my nervous system will come down, you know, and that starts to yield a different amount of confidence in oneself as well. It's like, oh, I'm not just going to escalate into flooding. I can actually experience regulation. And that's a very different place.
Absolutely, and thank you for adding this like vocabulary and perspective to it, because that's exactly what I was trying to say. And if we have time for another example, which also leads into another topic, I'm not sure if we have time for that, which is intensity versus healthy aggression. So what we also discovered with some of the horses, and here I'm going to come back to the young horse Samaya, and to growing the window of tolerance for intensity. Because that's another question that we were discussing with Maureen, is that, you know, like in some horsemanship techniques or programs, you know, like horses are being put under a lot of pressure in order to grow their tolerance for, you know, like situations like, for example, galloping really fast or, you know, like something. And I said, I don't disagree with the idea, because, you know, like, why not grow our window of tolerance for more intensity? You know, like if a young horse learns how to gallop fast, and that not being a big deal, you know, like that adds an element of safety. because then, you know, they learn, okay, I can go up and I can come back down again. I don't have to, it doesn't have to escalate. And that's exactly what happened with Samaya, is that as we were gradually introducing her to more intensity, like some people call it pressure, but I prefer to call it intensity because it's not a negative thing. And when accelerating her on the lunge, for example, into more of a gallop, we would not use the whip, but rather use our own energy to do that. And really move into something that is more like high in energy. We would run with her and then go like, oh, okay. And now we calm down, and paying attention to those thresholds in order not to like drive her beyond her window, but just see, okay, how far can I go so that she can still easily regulate back down? And that was really a very good experience because we found that she quite naturally adapted to that and really grew her tolerance. And that's okay. That's okay.
And the big thing that I think is interesting here is this whole conversation around, and this is often the conversations that end up happening between sort of the more sort of positive reinforcement folks against the negative reinforcement folks, which is, well, you know, you want to do things that are least aversive as possible so that the horse isn't experiencing increased stress, because increased stress in the nervous system is a problem, and there's stress-free learning and all these kinds of things. There's also research that shows that a certain amount of stress involved in learning is okay. I mean, that's part of the learning process. It does involve a bit of stress. The issue that I find is interesting is this misperception around stress, that all stress equals bad. And there's a very big difference between, say, arousal in the nervous system versus fight or flight activation, which is survival drive in the nervous system. And can we differentiate between arousal and activation? Not all activation is arousal, but not all arousal is activation. And I think the issue comes into play is where that neuroception of safety comes in. If the animal isn't feeling safe, and the intensity increases and the animal starts to go into a neuroception of danger, and the relationship is not safe for the animal, and the human is coming across in a more predatory way, and the intensity that's being raised to get the horse to start to move at a faster pace, let's say, is actually overcoupled for the human with rage or violence, you know, and that usually can speak to a trauma response or an incomplete fight response, then yeah, absolutely, things like raising intensity or increasing pressure can be problematic for the animal, because now we're getting into punitive trauma reenactments, which is very, very different from, hey, we're in a connected relationship, we feel safe with one another, we've got enough ventral vagal capacity to temper this so that it feels fun and engaged, so that even though the intensity is increasing, we're not feeling unsafe with each other, and it feels like it's within a threshold that's tolerable. And so it's kind of like the difference between, to use an example that I think is the best example possible, would be like, you know, between sex and between rape, right? So sex to a certain degree is going to involve healthy arousal, and there's going to be some increases in intensity within that. And when that's done within the safety of a relationship where I feel safe and you feel safe, and there's consent, and there's all these bits and pieces, and I feel attuned to you, and we're monitoring each other, and we've got that sense of connection to all the nuance, and we're able to, you know, calibrate in the experience, then intensity in and of itself is not a problem. Right? It becomes a problem when the neuroception shifts, and now I feel unsafe with you. And now it's no longer about healthy arousal. We're now getting into activation, which sends it into a completely different category, you know? And so there's this idea of differentiating between what would be an increase in intensity, and that is not the same thing as violence. And for so many people, the two have become equated, where if I pick up my energy and say, ask a horse to move a little bit more quickly around me, that suddenly it means I'm being aggressive or violent or mean, or somehow this is traumatizing or abusive. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. You know, we increase our intensity with one another all the time. Can we have a more nuanced perception of this? You know, horses, if I think of horses under natural settings, horses that live in the wild, right? I think of Lucy Reese's work. So feral horses, et cetera, they live in non-captivity conditions. And so their environments are a lot more about affiliative behavior, right? The herd gets along and survives because they have so much social engagement and they have so much safety with one another, so that when there are moments where intensity increases, which it will, and it does, especially as the horses teach the youngsters about boundaries and proxemics and how much space is comfortable space and when do we enter space and when do we back away. When those teachings happen and intensity or aggression increases, it comes back down and the relationship is still there. The temporary mobilization of what Peter Levine calls healthy aggression isn't actually a problem because it's very quick, it's very intentional, it's got its moment. And it's done within the safety of connected relationship. And so all those things make a difference between I'm going to do this constantly to penalize and to create a punitive experience when the nervous system isn't able to come back down. Dr. Levine talks about how the stress is not the issue. It's the nervous system's inability to reset itself after an experience. And so how do we then work with setting the conditions so that whatever is mobilized will deactivate, and it's also experienced within safety, so that the valence of it or the nuance of it or the felt sense of it is quite different than just this, oh, I'm gonna crack this whip and get you to run fast, and I'm gonna get you to go quickly, and then I'm gonna suddenly remove the pressure once I see that you're being compliant. And then I'm going to then remove the pressure because now I've created a compliant animal because I've used that flight response to get you to be subservient to me. So I get to be dominant. If that's the frame, then that's a problem. But not all increases of intensity or decreases of intensity carry that same intention or that same misattunement, so to speak.
And the very same is true, like for the space of boundaries, and horses, all of them will inevitably invite us to take our space because that's what they do naturally between themselves. So what we need, like in our own energy, and that's what the healthy aggression is for, is the, like, okay, here I am, and this is my space. Mm-hmm. And if the horse moves into that space in a way that is feeling unsafe for me, I need to be able to say, no, I don't want that. Mm-hmm. And mobilizing this energy and communicating with the animal is a very relationship establishing thing to do, because they will be a lot more attuned because they can sense me and they can sense, okay, this is your boundary. Okay. And this is what they learn. And particularly young horses, I sometimes have the impression that it's for them, they have to learn how to be around a human because they don't quite know what it's like, and they don't quite know that we are more vulnerable than them, maybe at the beginning, or that's maybe true for some. I mean, I had this experience with my horse Tao, who was, when he was a young stallion, he was very playful and he wanted to play with me. And he wanted to, like I was leading him and he would rear and just go like, oh, let's play. So I had to teach him that it doesn't feel safe to me when you do that. And they can very well learn that. And therefore we need to be able to step into this place of claiming our space. And for a lot of people, this is, like a field of trauma. This is where they have experienced trauma because taking their space wasn't a safe experience. Mm-hmm. And that then, gets confused because taking their space would often encounter violence. Mm-hmm. And that's, where a lot of activation sometimes happens. And even observing a situation like that can trigger a lot of those old memories.
We see this in the round pen. So experiences in the round pen where the person is, and I'm not advocating for or against round pens here, that's a whole other conversation, but I'm just saying, here's an example. So if you have a horse in a round pen, and you have a person who's trying to work on increasing the ask or the intensity to get the horse to move from a walk to like a trot to, say, a gallop, for instance. And the human has these experiences, oh gosh, I I can't mobilize a fight. I don't know how to mobilize a boundary or a fight response, because as I do so, I come into contact with all this unresolved charge in my nervous system. And the person typically winds up being in a very passive place because they don't want to step up because it wasn't safe to step up. Sometimes it can swing from that polarization of being hypo-aroused, of being very shut down, to being almost over the top, too much aggression too quickly. And it goes from I don't have any kind of experience to too much of it. And then there's this misperception that, well, no, this is bad, we shouldn't do this. And it's like, well, no, because there's a lack of mid-range. The lack of mid-range tells us there may be a trauma pattern here where there isn't any access to these nuanced state shifts, right? Where the person is passive. I'm just going to be really passive and not make any requests and not be, not voice myself in relationships, period, regardless of species. And then I'm asked to raise my intensity a little bit. And if that person hasn't done some of that work in the nervous system to differentiate between, intensity, healthy aggression, and violence, and work with whatever incomplete fight responses might be in the nervous system, we can see that almost that quick transition into like a flooding experience for the human, where they're so passive, and then they're asked to increase, and they increase too much too quickly without the nuances of threshold, because they're coming into contact with this incomplete activation. And then those experiences can happen, and that reinforces this misperception that, oh, well, I shouldn't do this. This is bad. I'm just going to only do, say, positive reinforcement and never do any of this other stuff because that stuff is dangerous. When in reality, the perception of danger may be because of the incomplete trauma. No, Tron, not right now, sweetheart. Because of the incomplete trauma. Right. And so the story that we tell us, Deb Dana, who's a really strong polyvagal advocate, and again, polyvagal theory is, and I've said this before, those of you who know me know that this is but one of many models. There are things about it that are, in question, and it's a map, and the map is not the terrain. There are many, many maps to make sense of the terrain, but this is one that we use because we find it really fun and interesting to use. And it's very helpful. If there isn't, like Deb Dana talks about how state influences story. So the story that we say about something is often determined by the nervous system state that we're in. And so if I have a nervous system state experience of feeling unsafe about something because of what's left in my nervous system of an incomplete experience previously, then that will influence the story or the interpretation I have of something, when in reality, that interpretation may actually be shifted. If I work on the nervous system state shifts and I work on healing the trauma, then the story changes about what I'm noticing. And so I want to hold that in mind as well, is how many misperceptions are there out there of certain techniques that are actually grounded in a trauma response.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. And I can only resonate by saying, I think that working with horses definitely invites us to increase the capacity for our own range of emotion, and to really, like most people are either on the spectrum of, okay, I don't dare, I don't say, I keep it all in, I can't set a boundary, it's too activating, or they are like too quickly on the other side of the spectrum, where too quickly they are being violent and punitive. And like developing really like the middle, and also being able to be very attuned and very soft, and at the same time very clear and very responsive. And like it's almost like a flexibility, or I don't know what you call it, what's a better word, it's almost like an agility, where you're getting more agile in moving through those notions, and you are like really responsive. I really like that word, because you're not reactive, but you are responsive. You respond to what is happening, and you're interacting as a reliable a partner for the horse. And that is probably, from my experience, one of the most safety creating components of the interaction, because the horse will get to know our nervous system, we get to know their nervous system, and they will quite naturally develop a bond with us in that.
And I think this is where I love the humane hierarchy, and I find that there's some caveats around it for me, which is, you know, if you look at the humane hierarchy, you'll see that it's really later in the hierarchy that negative reinforcement is brought in. And they're saying, you know, do everything else that's positive reinforcement based first before bringing in negative reinforcement. And that's the one place I'll take exception to this is absolutely, I agree that we need to be doing what's least aversive, minimally invasive. Let's set the conditions, right? Let's work on the attunement. Let's work on the relationship. But I think where negative reinforcement has unfortunately gotten a bad reputation is because of how it can miss the thresholds, how we can encounter these issues with unresolved trauma and unresolved sort of fight response activation in the nervous system, resulting in sort of like these turbulent experiences when thresholds get crossed, resulting in flooding or misuse of the application of pressure to induce a sort of a submissive experience in the animal, that, you know, flooding followed by submission, you know, and all that is not necessarily the issue of negative reinforcement. That's the issue of the nervous system that's utilizing the negative reinforcement. And so I kind of go, you know, is it always going to be the last thing in the list? Not necessarily. Horses use minor pressure and release with each other all the time. The issue is, how are we perceiving the nervous system? What is our understanding of the role of stress? Are we differentiating between arousal and activation? What is the distinction there? Is this occurring within a safe relationship where we feel safe with one another, and that connection is still available even as intensity increases, and intensity increasing it without it going into activation, right? These are all these nuances that I go, well, if all that was taken into consideration, that makes the experience of negative reinforcement very different in terms of what it can be. And it's all about the attunement and the safety, as opposed to, well, this is wrong or bad, therefore start here and only do this piece. It's a very limited perspective, you know, I'm all for positive reinforcement. I'm all for clicker training. I love that. You know, there's bits and pieces that I find very helpful from all of this. And we need to hold this bigger frame, you know, around what else is going on here. How do we support that safety and security and those nuances around trauma recovery for the human? So whatever technique is used in a more nuanced way that is about the relationship and the safety. And when the relationship is there, that is reinforcing for the animal, that is supportive, you know, of the experience. And that can be its own positive thing, you know, if we were to use that language a little differently from how it's used in the term positive reinforcement. But so I think this is this piece around, if we can heal the human trauma, does that make the horsemanship method appear differently or be experienced differently? And so these are really helpful questions, I find, that, you know, are important to have.
Yeah, and it invites for more exploration. Huh?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying these spaces a lot, and I'm going to be continuing the experimentation. And there's quite a few other horses out there that we haven't quite done any experiences with. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And Maureen she's going back to Germany now in the next couple of months, but she's coming back in the summer, and she's looking to stay a bit more long term. So yeah, I think we'll be continuing on this journey. I find it very, very enriching, and I learn a lot.
Yeah, certainly. And I would love to chat again if you're willing, to see what new sort of insights and explorations come as a result of the ongoing process that you're having with your own animals and with Maureen and anyone else that you're collaborating with. If that feels, if there's consent there, then absolutely would love to hear more about that. But thank you for this exploration, Ines. I'm really grateful for your time today.
Yes, and Sarah, it's a great pleasure. I really love talking to you, and we have so many parallels and things in common. I really find this very complementary. So just thank you so much. I'm very grateful that we are part of each other's lives, and I'm looking forward to more.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks everybody. Stay tuned for more interviews to come.
Yeah.